If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, Seeds of Protest, A Road to the March. Part 1, The Legacy of Racial Inequality and Economic Injustice. The story of America's greatest civil rights gathering begins not in 1963, but decades earlier, when the promise of freedom after the Civil War crumbled into something far darker. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southern states moved quickly to build a new system of control. They called it Jim Crow, named after a racist character in minstrel shows. But it was really a web of laws designed to keep Black Americans trapped in second-class citizenship. These laws touched every part of daily life. Black children couldn't attend white schools. Black families couldn't live in white neighborhoods. Black workers couldn't eat lunch with white coworkers. In many places, Black people couldn't even drink from the same water fountains or use the same bathrooms. Voting became nearly impossible through poll taxes, literacy tests with trick questions, and outright violence at polling places. The economic reality proved equally harsh. Most Black families in the South worked as sharecroppers, farming land they could never own while owing money to white landowners year after year. In cities, the best jobs went to white workers. Black men found work as janitors, porters, or laborers. Black women cleaned white families' homes or worked in their kitchens. Professional careers remained largely closed off. This system wasn't limited to the South. Northern cities practiced their own forms of exclusion. Banks refused loans to Black families wanting to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. Factories hired Black workers only for the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs. Restaurants and hotels turned away Black customers. Even in states without Jim Crow laws, informal agreements kept Black Americans on the margins. Then came the Great War, and everything began to shift. Between 1916 and 1970, 6 million Black Americans packed their belongings and headed north in what historians call the Great Migration. They left behind cotton fields and small towns, seeking factory jobs in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia. They found work in steel mills, automobile plants, and meatpacking houses. For the first time since slavery, large numbers of Black families earned steady wages. This movement changed America's cities forever. Neighborhoods that had been all white suddenly heard jazz music, smelled Southern cooking, and saw children playing games their parents had brought from Mississippi and Alabama. White residents often responded with fear and anger, sometimes with violence. But something else was happening too. Black communities in the North grew stronger and more connected. They built churches, newspapers, and political organizations. By the 1940s, a new generation of Black leaders emerged from this urban growth. They had steady jobs, could vote, and weren't afraid to speak up. They looked at the gap between America's promises and its actions, especially as the country prepared to fight fascism overseas while practicing segregation at home. The seeds of protest were planted in this rich soil of migration, hope, and growing frustration with injustice. Part 2. A. Philip Randolph's Vision. Early Plans for a March on Washington, 1941. A labor organizer named A. Philip Randolph saw what others missed. In 1941, America was building tanks and planes for a war against fascism. Yet Black workers couldn't get jobs in the very factories making weapons for freedom. The irony burned in Randolph's mind like a flame that wouldn't die. Randolph led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the most powerful Black labor union in America. He had spent years fighting for fair wages and decent treatment for men who served wealthy white passengers on trains. Now, he watched defense contractors rake in millions of government dollars while refusing to hire Black workers or promoting them beyond janitor jobs. The idea struck him with simple force. What if 100,000 Black Americans marched to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial? What if they demanded jobs in defense plants and equal treatment in government offices? The president would have to listen. the whole world would see America's contradiction. Randolph began organizing with the same methodical precision he used in union work. He sent letters to black newspapers across the country. He spoke at churches and union halls. The response amazed even him. Workers, teachers, and preachers volunteered to come to Washington. They were tired of watching white workers get good-paying jobs while they swept floors. President Franklin Roosevelt heard about the planned march and grew nervous. America was trying to convince other countries to join the fight against Hitler. How would it look if 100,000 black citizens had to march for basic fairness in the nation's capital? Roosevelt sent his wife Eleanor and other officials to meet with Randolph. They offered small concessions and vague promises. Randolph listened politely but held firm. He wanted concrete action, not kind words. Faced with the certainty of an embarrassing protest, Roosevelt made a deal. He created the Fair Employment Practice Committee, the first federal agency dedicated to preventing job discrimination. Defense contractors receiving government money had to hire workers regardless of race. In return, Randolph called off the march. Many criticized Randolph's decision. They argued he had accepted crumbs when he could have demanded the whole loaf. But Randolph understood something deeper. He had proven that the threat of mass action could force a president's hand. The march that never happened had still changed America. The Fair Employment Practice Committee opened thousands of jobs to black workers. More importantly, Randolph had shown that organized pressure could crack the wall of discrimination. He had created a blueprint for future protests. 20 years later, when younger leaders revived the idea of marching on Washington, they would build on the foundation Randolph had laid. The seeds he planted in 1941 would finally bloom in the summer of 1963, when his dream of a massive demonstration would at last become reality. Part 3. The Role of World War II and the Fair Employment Practice Committee. The war that changed everything began in 1941, but for black Americans, it revealed a painful truth. They were asked to fight for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home. As young men lined up to serve their country, defense factories refused to hire them. Shipyards posted signs reading, "Whites only." The military itself remained segregated. Black soldiers trained separately, ate separately, and often faced violence from white troops who should have been their brothers in arms. Out of this contradiction grew a powerful idea called the Double V Campaign. Black newspapers and community leaders declared they would fight two wars at once. One against fascism overseas, another against racism at home. The Pittsburgh Courier newspaper printed the rallying cry on its front page. Soon, black families across America displayed double V flags in their windows, showing they understood the connection between Hitler's hatred and their own daily struggles. The Fair Employment Practice Committee that Roosevelt created to stop Randolph's 1941 march did open some doors. For the first time, federal law banned job discrimination in defense work. Black workers flooded into shipyards and aircraft plants. Women like Rose Will Monroe built bombers while their sons fought overseas. But the FEPC had no real power to punish companies that ignored its rules. Many employers found ways around the new requirements. When the war ended, so did most opportunities. Returning white soldiers got their old jobs back. Black workers found themselves pushed out once again. The FEPC itself died a quiet death in 1946 when Congress refused to fund it. Politicians who had praised black sacrifice during wartime suddenly had no interest in protecting black rights during peace. But something fundamental had changed. Nearly 1 million black men had served in uniform. They had seen Paris without segregation. They had fought alongside French resistance fighters who judged them only by their courage. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed the ultimate result of racial hatred. These veterans returned home with new expectations and zero patience for old excuses. James Farmer came back from the war determined to challenge segregation directly. Medgar Evers returned to Mississippi, ready to register voters despite death threats. Thousands of others quietly decided they would no longer step off sidewalks when white people approached. The war had taught them that change required action, not just patience. White resistance grew fierce in response. Lynchings increased. The Ku Klux Klan recruited new members. Southern politicians promised to preserve segregation at any cost. But black communities had learned something powerful during the war years. When they organized together, when they threatened economic pressure, even presidents listened. The lesson of 1941 had not been forgotten. Mass action could force change. The stage was now set for the battles that would define the next 2 decades. Part 4: Revival of the March Plans and the Rising Tide of Grassroots Activism. By 1954, something extraordinary happened that changed everything. The Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that separate schools for black and white children were illegal. For the first time since Reconstruction, the highest court in America said segregation was wrong. The ruling sent shockwaves through both black and white communities. In the South, white politicians vowed massive resistance. But in black neighborhoods across the country, people felt a spark of hope they had not experienced in decades. That spark became a flame in Montgomery, Alabama. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in December 1955, she lit a fuse that had been building since the war. The Montgomery bus boycott began the next day. For 381 days, black citizens walked to work instead of riding the buses. They organized carpools. They wore out their shoes. They lost jobs, but they did not give up. A young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as their leader, preaching nonviolent resistance with a power that stirred souls. The boycott worked. The buses were integrated. More importantly, black Americans across the country watched and learned. They saw that ordinary people could challenge the system and win. The lesson of 1941 had been proven again, but this time it lasted over a year and involved an entire community. Students took the next bold step. In February 1960, 4 black college freshmen sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. When they were refused service, they simply sat there. The sit-in movement exploded across the South. Within weeks, thousands of young people were sitting at lunch counters, standing in department stores and filling up jails. They faced violence with dignity. They met hatred with calm determination. These local actions created something powerful. Television cameras captured police officers attacking peaceful protesters. Newspapers carried stories of brave students being arrested for ordering coffee. Americans who had never thought much about segregation suddenly saw its ugly face in their living rooms every night. The movement was no longer just about jobs or voting rights. It had become about human dignity. In churches and community centers, people who had never considered themselves activists began talking about marching on Washington. The idea that A. Philip Randolph had planted 20 years earlier was growing roots in fertile ground. By the early 1960s, the momentum was building towards something bigger than anyone had imagined. Local victories had created national awareness. Young activists were pushing older leaders to take bolder action. The federal government was being forced to pay attention. The conditions were perfect for a massive demonstration that would demand not just gradual change, but immediate action on jobs and freedom for all Americans. Part 5. The formation of the Big Six and early coalition building. The momentum building across America in the early 1960s demanded leadership that could channel grassroots energy into organized action. By 1962, civil rights organizations had grown powerful in their own spheres, but they often worked separately, sometimes even competing with each other. The time had come for these separate streams to flow together into something much larger. A. Philip Randolph, now in his 70s, understood that his dream of a march on Washington needed more than just his labor union connections. He reached out to the most influential civil rights leaders in America, proposing they unite their organizations under one common cause. The response was both encouraging and challenging. Martin Luther King Jr. brought the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with its network of churches and ministers across the South. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance had proven effective in Montgomery and Birmingham, attracting national attention and white sympathy. Roy Wilkins led the NAACP, the oldest and most established civil rights organization, with its focus on legal challenges and legislative victories. Whitney Young headed the National Urban League, which concentrated on economic opportunities and professional advancement for Black Americans. The younger voices proved equally important, but more difficult to manage. John Lewis represented the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, filled with college students and young activists who had risked their lives in sit-ins and freedom rides. They were impatient with gradual change and suspicious of compromise. James Farmer led the Congress of Racial Equality, pioneers of the freedom rides who believed in direct action and confrontation with segregation. Getting these 6 leaders to agree on anything was like herding cats. Each organization had its own methods, priorities, and supporters. The NAACP preferred working through courts and Congress. SNCC wanted immediate action, even if it meant confrontation. The Urban League focused on jobs and economic advancement. CORE pushed for direct challenges to segregation everywhere. Their first meetings were tense. Young activists questioned whether older leaders truly understood the urgency of the moment. Established organizations worried that radical tactics might alienate potential white allies. Everyone had strong opinions about who should speak, what demands to make, and how to organize such a massive event. Yet they all shared one crucial understanding. Alone, each organization had limitations. Together, they could represent every segment of the Black community and many white allies. Randolph's decades of experience, King's moral authority, Wilkins' political connections, Young's business relationships, Lewis's youth energy, and Farmer's tactical knowledge created a combination no single organization could match. Slowly, through countless phone calls and face-to-face meetings, they hammered out agreements. They would focus on jobs and freedom. Combining economic demands with civil rights, they would emphasize nonviolence and dignity, presenting an image that would win over undecided Americans. Most importantly, they would speak with one voice, setting aside organizational rivalries for this historic moment. This coalition of the Big Six represented something unprecedented in American civil rights history. Never before had such diverse organizations and approaches come together under unified leadership. Their success in building this alliance would determine whether the march could truly represent the breadth and depth of the movement for racial justice. Chapter 2: Organizing a Movement, Planning the Historic March. Part 1: Bayard Rustin's Strategic Leadership and Logistics Operation. Behind the grand vision of bringing hundreds of thousands of people to Washington stood a man whose name few would remember, yet whose genius made it all possible. Bayard Rustin, a 53-year-old veteran activist with decades of experience in nonviolent protest, became the chief architect of what seemed like an impossible dream. While others gave speeches and made headlines, Rustin worked 18-hour days in a cramped office, turning chaos into order, with nothing more than determination and an extraordinary mind for detail. Rustin brought unique qualifications to this massive undertaking. He had spent years learning the tactics of peaceful resistance, studying Gandhi's methods, and organizing smaller protests that taught him how crowds moved and how people behaved under pressure. More importantly, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to see problems before they happened and solve them with creative solutions that others never considered. The challenges seemed overwhelming. How do you feed 250,000 people in a single day? Where do they use bathrooms? How do you get them to Washington without the city's transportation system collapsing? What happens if violence breaks out? Rustin attacked each problem with methodical precision, creating detailed plans that covered everything from sandwich distribution to emergency medical care. He negotiated with bus companies across the nation, arranging special charter rates and coordinating arrival times so the streets wouldn't become gridlocked. He worked with local churches to provide overnight housing for early arrivals. He arranged for 292 buses from New York alone, each with carefully planned routes and departure schedules. Trains were chartered from Chicago, Detroit, and dozens of other cities, all timed to arrive within hours of each other. The logistics extended far beyond transportation. Rustin organized volunteer teams to distribute 80,000 lunches, arranged for portable toilets, coordinated with Washington police for crowd control, and established communication systems using walkie-talkies and runners. He created a detailed timeline for the day's events, accounting for everything from sound system tests to cleanup crews. Perhaps most challenging was managing the personalities involved. Civil rights leaders often disagreed on tactics, goals, and who should receive credit. Rustin somehow kept them focused on the common goal, smoothing over conflicts and ensuring everyone felt heard while maintaining forward momentum toward August 28th. His background as a gay man and former Communist Party member made him controversial. Some leaders worried his presence would give opponents ammunition to attack the march. Yet his irreplaceable skills and unwavering commitment to the cause made him indispensable. He worked largely behind the scenes, avoiding publicity while ensuring every detail fell into place. As summer progressed, Rustin's careful planning began paying dividends. Bus companies confirmed their schedules. Churches opened their doors. Volunteers received their assignments. What had seemed like an impossible dream was becoming a logistical reality, one carefully planned detail at a time. Part 2. Broadening Alliances, from the Big Six to the Big Ten. With Rustin's logistical framework taking shape, the organizers faced their next challenge: building a coalition broad enough to capture America's attention and diverse enough to represent the movement's true scope. The original Big Six civil rights leaders knew they needed more voices at the table if the march was going to succeed. Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, became one of their most important allies. His union brought financial muscle and organizational experience that cash-strapped civil rights groups desperately needed. Reuther understood that workers' rights and civil rights were connected battles. When he committed his union's resources, other labor organizations followed. The AFL-CIO provided buses, funding, and thousands of members ready to march. Religious leaders proved equally vital to expanding the coalition. Rabbi Joachim Prinz of the American Jewish Congress joined the leadership circle, bringing Jewish communities into the fold. His own experience fleeing Nazi Germany gave him a powerful voice on the dangers of remaining silent in the face of injustice. Protestant and Catholic leaders also stepped forward, seeing the march as a moral imperative that transcended racial boundaries. Women's organizations added another crucial dimension to the growing alliance. Groups like the National Council of Negro Women, led by Dorothy Height, insisted that women's voices be heard in the planning and execution of the march. Though Height was the only woman among the main organizers, she worked to ensure female activists received recognition for their contributions to the movement. Student groups from colleges across the country pledged their support, bringing youthful energy and campus networks that could mobilize quickly. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had already proven their organizing abilities through sit-ins and freedom rides. Their participation helped bridge generational gaps within the movement. Each new group brought different perspectives and priorities to the planning table. Labor unions wanted to emphasize economic justice and job discrimination. Religious groups focused on moral arguments against segregation. Women's organizations pushed for broader civil rights language that included gender equality. Students wanted more radical action and faster change. The organizers had to carefully balance these competing interests while crafting a message that would unite rather than divide their diverse coalition. They settled on economic and civil rights themes that could appeal to workers, religious believers, students, and activists alike. The march's official name reflected this balance: the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This delicate negotiation process revealed both the strength and the complexity of the growing movement. Every new ally brought resources and legitimacy, but also new demands and expectations. The organizers discovered that building a truly inclusive coalition required constant communication, compromise, and careful attention to each group's concerns. As August approached, what had started as a march organized by 6 civil rights leaders had grown into a massive coalition representing millions of Americans from all backgrounds. This transformation would prove essential to the march's ultimate impact and success. Part 3. Overcoming Opposition and FBI Surveillance. Even as the coalition grew stronger, powerful enemies watched from the shadows. President John Kennedy sat in the White House, torn between supporting civil rights and fearing political disaster. He worried that a massive march might turn violent, giving his opponents ammunition to attack him. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, shared these concerns. They both knew that any chaos in Washington would damage their administration and hurt the civil rights cause. Behind closed doors, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover saw the march as a dangerous threat. He believed communist agents were secretly controlling the civil rights movement. Hoover ordered his agents to watch Martin Luther King Jr. around the clock. They tapped his phones, opened his mail, and followed him wherever he went. The FBI also kept close tabs on Bayard Rustin, whose past involvement with socialist groups made him a prime target for suspicion. The surveillance went far beyond simple observation. FBI agents spread rumors about the march organizers, trying to destroy their reputations. They planted stories in newspapers suggesting that communist infiltrators were pulling the strings behind the march. Hoover personally briefed President Kennedy about these alleged communist connections, hoping to convince him to oppose the demonstration. Political opposition came from multiple directions. Southern senators threatened to block Kennedy's civil rights legislation if he supported the march. They painted vivid pictures of violent riots destroying the nation's capital. Conservative newspapers warned that the march would bring chaos to Washington's peaceful streets. Many moderate politicians advised the organizers to call off the event entirely. Within the civil rights movement itself, disagreements created additional pressure. Some activists wanted a more confrontational approach, believing that polite demonstrations would never force real change. Others worried that the march had become too moderate, watered down to please white allies. These internal debates drained energy and created tension among organizers who needed unity. The Kennedy administration gradually shifted from opposition to cautious support as organizers addressed their concerns. March leaders promised tight security and discipline. They agreed to modify some of their demands to avoid appearing too radical. They also worked closely with Washington police to plan routes and safety measures. This careful negotiation slowly won over skeptical officials. Despite the constant surveillance and political pressure, the organizers refused to back down. They knew that powerful people wanted them to fail, but this only strengthened their resolve. King and his colleagues understood that they were making history, even as FBI agents recorded their every phone call and meeting. The climate of suspicion created enormous stress for the march leaders. They had to plan a massive demonstration while knowing that government agents were trying to sabotage their efforts. This atmosphere of distrust and surveillance would shadow the movement for years to come, but it could not stop the momentum building toward that historic day in August. Part 4. The Role of Labor Unions and White Allies in the Movement. While FBI agents watched their every move, the march organizers knew they needed more than determination to succeed. They needed money, people, and resources on a scale that seemed impossible? The answer came from an unexpected source that would reshape the entire movement. Walter Reuther stood at the head of the United Auto Workers Union, commanding over 1 million members across America's factories. When he pledged support for the march, he brought more than just words. The UAW opened their treasury, writing checks that kept the entire operation running. Union members printed flyers, made phone calls, and arranged buses from Detroit to Washington. Reuther himself would stand on the platform with King, showing America that this was not just a black cause, but a workers' cause. Other unions followed Reuther's lead. The AFL-CIO hesitated at first, worried about alienating white members, but eventually provided crucial backing. Steelworkers, teachers, and government employees pooled resources that civil rights groups could never have raised alone. These partnerships solved the movement's biggest problem: how to fund a massive demonstration when most supporters earned modest wages. White clergy brought different but equally vital resources. Rabbis from New York synagogues organized carpools. Catholic priests used parish networks to spread the word. Protestant ministers opened their churches for planning meetings. These religious leaders gave the march something money could not buy: moral legitimacy in mainstream America. When white pastors stood with black activists, it became harder for opponents to dismiss the movement as radical or dangerous. College students provided young energy and organizational skills. They had time that working adults lacked, and connections that crossed racial lines. Student groups coordinated campus recruitment drives and managed complex travel arrangements. Many had participated in earlier protests, bringing experience in nonviolent tactics and crowd management. These alliances created constant tension within the movement. Some black activists worried about losing control of their own struggle. They questioned whether white allies truly understood their experience or simply wanted to feel good about themselves. Union leaders sometimes pushed economic issues over racial concerns. Religious groups avoided topics they considered too controversial. The money flowing from white institutions came with strings attached. Donors wanted reassurance that speakers would not be too radical or confrontational. They preferred messages about American ideals rather than harsh criticism of American reality. March organizers found themselves balancing authentic black voices with what their supporters wanted to hear. Despite these complications, the partnerships worked. White allies provided resources that made the march possible, while black leaders maintained control of the message and strategy. Churches became meeting places, union halls hosted training sessions, and college campuses served as recruitment centers. By summer 1963, a network spanning race, class, and religion was mobilizing for the largest civil rights demonstration in American history. Part 5. Mobilizing the Nation: Fundraising, Recruitment, and Training. The summer of 1963 transformed into a massive recruitment drive that stretched across America. Civil rights organizers needed to do something that had never been done before: bring 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. for a peaceful demonstration. This meant reaching into every corner of the country, from small rural churches to big city union halls. Money became the first major challenge. The march needed funds for buses, trains, sound equipment, portable toilets, and food for hundreds of thousands of people. A. Philip Randolph and his team created a fundraising machine that worked through multiple channels. They sold buttons and pamphlets, passed collection plates at Sunday services, and organized benefit concerts. Harry Belafonte used his celebrity status to host fundraising events in New York, bringing together wealthy supporters who wrote large checks. Small donations poured in from ordinary families who scraped together dollar bills and loose change. The publicity campaign operated like a well-oiled machine. Organizers printed millions of flyers and mailed them to every civil rights organization, labor union, and progressive church they could find. Radio stations in black communities broadcast daily reminders about the march. Newspapers ran stories about the growing movement, and word spread through beauty salons, barbershops, and community centers. College students became key messengers, traveling home for summer break with stacks of information to share with their families and friends. Training sessions became crucial preparation for what everyone expected would be a tense day. Organizers knew that any violence could destroy their cause and provide ammunition for their opponents. They set up workshops in cities across the country where volunteers learned the principles of nonviolent resistance. People practiced how to protect themselves if attacked, how to fall safely, and how to shield others from harm. They role-played scenarios where hostile crowds might spit, shout, or throw objects at them. The instructions were clear and specific. Marchers received detailed guidelines about what to wear, what to bring, and how to behave. No alcohol, no weapons, no provocative signs. They should dress neatly, speak respectfully, and remain calm no matter what happened. Volunteers distributed maps showing where to gather, which routes to take, and where to find food and restrooms. Every detail mattered because organizers understood that the entire civil rights movement would be judged by what happened on that single day. Local coordinators emerged in cities nationwide, taking responsibility for organizing their communities. These grassroots leaders arranged transportation, collected donations, and spread the word through their networks. Churches became command centers where volunteers stuffed envelopes, made phone calls, and coordinated carpools. The work continued day and night as August approached. By late summer, the momentum had become unstoppable. Buses were chartered, train tickets purchased, and thousands of people had committed to making the journey to Washington. The careful preparation and passionate commitment of ordinary Americans had created something extraordinary. The stage was now set for a demonstration that would test whether all this planning and training would translate into the peaceful, powerful statement that organizers had envisioned. Chapter 3. The March Unfolds, August 28, 1963. Part 1. Arrival and Atmosphere. 250,000 gather at the National Mall. The first buses began rolling into Washington, D.C. before dawn on August 28, 1963. They came from Birmingham and Atlanta, from Detroit and New York, carrying people who had saved money for months to make this journey. Some traveled through the night, singing freedom songs to stay awake. Others rode in silence, clutching sandwiches packed by worried mothers who whispered prayers for their safe return. By 6 in the morning, Union Station buzzed with activity. Families stepped off trains, carrying handmade signs that read, "Jobs and freedom now," and "We march for integrated schools." Elderly women in their Sunday best walked alongside college students in work clothes. White clergymen from Minnesota mingled with black sharecroppers from Mississippi. The crowd grew larger with each arriving train and bus. Cars with license plates from dozens of states lined the streets around the National Mall. Fathers lifted sleepy children from back seats, while mothers straightened their clothes and checked their packed lunches. Many had driven through the night, stopping only for gas at stations where some attendants refused to serve them. They came anyway, knowing this day mattered more than personal comfort. The Washington Monument became the gathering point. By 8 o'clock, thousands of people spread across the grass like a human river. Organizers had hoped for 100,000 marchers. Looking out over the growing crowd, they realized something extraordinary was happening. People kept coming, streaming from every direction toward the monument's base. The mood felt electric, yet peaceful. Children played between the adults' legs while teenagers shared sandwiches with strangers. Labor union members talked quietly with Baptist ministers. Jewish rabbis walked arm in arm with Catholic nuns. Everyone understood they were part of something bigger than themselves. Fear mixed with hope in many faces. Some participants wondered if violence would erupt as it had in other civil rights demonstrations. Police officers watched from street corners, their presence both reassuring and worrying. Television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting live images to millions of Americans watching from home. As the morning sun climbed higher, the crowd continued swelling. 250,000 people now filled the space between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. Marshals wearing special armbands moved through the crowd, keeping everyone calm and organized. Their careful planning was working perfectly. The atmosphere grew more festive as people realized how many had answered the call. Strangers became friends over shared water bottles and stories of their journeys. Everyone carried the same determination: to demand jobs, freedom, and dignity for all Americans. This peaceful army was ready to march toward the Lincoln Memorial, where their voices would echo through history and change the nation forever. Part 2. Musical performances and cultural expressions of the movement. Music filled the air before any speeches began. Gospel voices rose above the massive crowd as Mahalia Jackson stepped forward, her powerful voice carrying the pain and hope of generations. She sang "How I Got Over," and 250,000 people fell silent, hanging on every note. This was not just entertainment. This was the soul of the movement, speaking through song. Bob Dylan and Joan Baez took the stage together, their folk guitars creating a different but equally moving sound. Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind" asked questions that everyone there was demanding answers to. When would freedom come? When would equality arrive? Baez's clear voice joined his, and the crowd swayed together, united by the simple melodies that spoke complex truths. Marian Anderson, the legendary contralto who had been denied the right to sing at Constitution Hall 24 years earlier because of her race, now stood before this sea of supporters. Her presence alone told a story of progress and persistence. When she sang, decades of struggle seemed to flow through her voice, reminding everyone why they had traveled so far to be here. Spirituals echoed across the National Mall. Songs that had sustained enslaved people through their darkest hours now lifted the spirits of their descendants, fighting for freedom in a new way. "We Shall Overcome" became a collective prayer, sung by voices of every age and background. The music connected past and present, creating a bridge between the suffering of previous generations and the hope of this moment. Signs and banners created a visual language of demand and determination. "Jobs and Freedom Now" appeared on countless placards. Equal rights for all Americans waved above the crowd. Some signs showed photographs of those killed fighting for civil rights, turning the march into a memorial as well as a protest. The creativity was striking. Homemade signs from small towns mixed with professionally printed banners from major organizations. Religious symbols appeared everywhere. Crosses, Stars of David, and interfaith messages showed this was not just a movement for African Americans, but a moral cause that crossed all boundaries. Ministers, rabbis, and priests stood side by side, their presence declaring that faith demanded justice. The visual impact was as powerful as the music. Television cameras captured the diversity of the crowd, the dignity of their dress, the orderliness of their gathering. Every image contradicted the stereotypes that opponents had spread about civil rights supporters. Here was respectability demanding respect, organization calling for opportunity. As the music continued, something magical happened. The massive crowd was no longer a collection of individuals, but a united voice. The songs had done their work, creating solidarity from diversity and strength from shared purpose. The stage was now set for the speakers who would follow, their words riding on the emotional foundation that music had built. Part 3. Landmark speeches by key figures, calls for justice and equality. As the final notes of the Freedom songs faded across the National Mall, the stage transformed into a platform for the most diverse collection of voices the civil rights movement had ever assembled. One by one, leaders from different organizations, faiths, and backgrounds stepped forward to address the 250,000 people gathered below. Each speaker brought their own perspective, yet all shared a common message that would echo through history. John Lewis, just 23 years old and representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had originally prepared a speech that would set the Lincoln Memorial on fire with its raw anger. His draft called the Civil Rights Bill inadequate and threatened to march through the South like Sherman's army. But in the hours before the march, other leaders convinced him to soften his words for the sake of unity. Even with changes, Lewis delivered perhaps the most passionate speech of the day, his youth and determination clear in every word. Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, stood as proof that this was more than just a civil rights march. This was a coalition fighting for economic justice. He spoke of how racial discrimination hurt all workers, black and white alike. His presence showed that labor unions understood their future was tied to civil rights, that economic freedom and racial freedom were inseparable. Rabbi Joachim Prince brought a different kind of moral authority to the podium. As a refugee from Nazi Germany, he had witnessed what happened when good people remained silent in the face of injustice. His words carried the weight of recent history, reminding America that bigotry unchecked could destroy nations. He spoke of the fear that comes with silence, making clear that this moment demanded courage from all Americans. Each speaker approached the podium knowing they represented millions who could not be there. A. Philip Randolph, the march's chief organizer, spoke with the authority of decades spent fighting for workers' rights. Floyd McKissick and James Farmer brought the perspective of direct action, having led sit-ins and freedom rides in the South. Their words carried the urgency of people who had faced police dogs and jail cells. The diversity of voices was intentional and powerful. Here was a movement that included young and old, Christians and Jews, labor leaders and preachers, radicals and moderates. Yet despite their different backgrounds and approaches, common themes emerge from every speech: jobs and freedom, dignity and justice, an end to the daily humiliation of segregation, the right to vote without fear. Television cameras captured not just the words, but the faces in the crowd, the nods of agreement, the tears of recognition. Each speaker built upon the last, creating a crescendo of moral authority that would be impossible to ignore. The stage was being set for the final speaker, the man everyone had come to hear, whose words would soon transform this gathering into legend. Part 4. Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. As the afternoon sun beat down on the Lincoln Memorial steps, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped forward to deliver what organizers expected would be another powerful speech. He carried with him carefully prepared remarks about the economic struggles facing Black Americans, filled with statistics and policy demands. The crowd of 250,000 stretched endlessly before him, their faces turned upward in expectation. King began reading from his prepared text, his rich baritone voice carrying across the National Mall. He spoke of the fierce urgency of now and America's failure to honor its promises to Black citizens. The crowd listened respectfully, but the energy felt somewhat contained. This was important material, but it sounded like many speeches they had heard before from their beloved leader. Then something magical happened. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel legend who had sung earlier in the program, sat directly behind King on the speaker's platform. As he neared the end of his prepared remarks, she called out in her powerful voice, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." She had heard him speak about his dream many times before in churches across the South, and she knew this crowd needed to hear that vision of hope. King paused for just a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. In that instant, he made a decision that would change American history. He pushed aside his prepared text and began to speak from his heart. "I have a dream," he declared, his voice rising with passion and conviction. The crowd suddenly came alive, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. What followed was perhaps the most memorable 4 minutes in the history of American oratory. King painted vivid pictures of a transformed America where his children would be judged by their character rather than their skin color. He spoke of Black and white children playing together, of justice rolling down like waters. Each repetition of "I have a dream" built upon the last, creating a crescendo of hope that lifted the spirits of everyone present. The crowd responded with waves of applause and shouts of yes and amen. Television cameras captured every word, broadcasting this moment of inspiration to millions of Americans watching from their living rooms. King's ability to transform abstract concepts of justice into concrete, relatable images made his message accessible to people of all backgrounds. The speech reached its climax as King borrowed from the spiritual "Free at Last," his voice ringing out across the mall. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The crowd erupted in sustained applause as King stepped back from the podium, visibly moved by the power of the moment he had just created. In those few minutes, King had transformed a political rally into something approaching a religious revival. His spontaneous decision to abandon his prepared text and speak from his heart had given the civil rights movement its most powerful and enduring statement of purpose. Part 5. The day's peaceful demonstration and media coverage. As Dr. King's words faded into history, something remarkable began to happen across America. Television cameras had captured every moment of the march, and the images flowing into living rooms nationwide told a story that surprised millions of viewers. Here was a gathering of 250,000 people that looked nothing like the chaos and violence many had feared. The crowd dispersed with the same dignity they had shown all day. Families packed their signs carefully. Groups of marchers helped clean up trash from the mall. Young and old, black and white, workers and students all moved peacefully toward buses and trains that would carry them home. Police officers, who had prepared for potential riots, instead found themselves directing traffic for one of the most orderly gatherings in Washington's history. Television anchors struggled to find words for what they were witnessing. Walter Cronkite described the remarkable discipline of the demonstrators. Network cameras showed scenes that contradicted every stereotype about civil rights protesters. Instead of angry mobs, viewers saw church choirs singing hymns. Instead of radical troublemakers, they saw families holding hands and ministers leading prayers. Newspaper editors across the country faced a challenge. Many had prepared stories assuming the march would end in violence or disorder. Instead, their reporters filed accounts of a day that resembled a church picnic more than a political protest. The New York Times called it the gentlest army ever to occupy a capital. The Washington Post marveled at the crowd's good humor and dignity. These images changed minds in ways that years of speeches and legislation could not. White Americans who had never met a civil rights protester saw ordinary people asking for basic fairness. Suburban families watching from their breakfast tables witnessed demonstrators who looked remarkably like themselves. Parents concerned about their children's future, workers seeking fair treatment, citizens believing in America's promise. Politicians felt the shift immediately. Senators who had dismissed civil rights leaders as extremists now faced constituents asking why these peaceful people seemed so reasonable. Congress members returned from summer recess to find their offices flooded with calls supporting the marchers' demands. The contrast between the violence shown against protesters in Birmingham and Selma and the peaceful dignity displayed in Washington created a powerful moral argument. The international impact proved equally significant. Soviet propaganda, which had long criticized American racism, suddenly seemed less effective when the world saw America's capacity for peaceful change. European allies watched with admiration as citizens exercised their democratic rights with such grace. By evening, as the last buses pulled away from Washington, something fundamental had shifted in America's conversation about race. The march had accomplished what its organizers hoped, but hardly dared expect. It had made the civil rights movement impossible to ignore or dismiss. The peaceful power of that August day would now force the nation to confront the justice of the demonstrators' cause and the urgency of their demands for change. Chapter 4: Transformative Impact, Aftermath and Legacy, Part 1: National and International Reaction to the March and Speech. Within hours of King's final words echoing across the Lincoln Memorial, newsrooms across America buzzed with activity. Television stations replayed footage of the massive crowd, while newspapers rushed to set headlines that would capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. The images were striking. 250,000 people, black and white, standing together in peaceful demonstration. Radio broadcasts carried King's voice into homes nationwide, his words about a dream resonating far beyond Washington's borders. President Kennedy watched the coverage from the White House, carefully measuring his response. While privately impressed by the march's discipline and scale, Kennedy remained cautious in his public statements. He met with march leaders that evening, praising their peaceful conduct while stopping short of fully endorsing their demands. Kennedy understood the political risks of appearing too supportive, knowing Southern Democrats still held significant power in Congress. His measured words reflected the delicate balance he tried to maintain between moral leadership and political pragmatism. International observers reacted with fascination and hope. European newspapers highlighted the contrast between America's democratic ideals and its treatment of black citizens. African leaders, many newly independent from colonial rule, saw parallels between their own struggles and the American civil rights movement. Soviet propaganda seized on the images as proof of American hypocrisy, though many behind the Iron Curtain quietly admired the marchers' courage and organization. Southern politicians responded predictably with defiance and dismissal. Governors and senators from segregated states called the march a publicity stunt, claiming it would only increase racial tensions. Some suggested outside agitators and communist influences had orchestrated the event. Local newspapers in the Deep South either ignored the march entirely or portrayed it as a threat to social order and traditional values. The most surprising reactions came from unexpected quarters. Many moderate Americans who had remained neutral on civil rights found themselves moved by the march's dignity and King's vision. Church leaders across the country began examining their own congregations' practices. Business executives in northern cities started questioning their hiring policies. The march had created a moment of national reflection that extended far beyond its immediate participants. Within weeks, the images from Washington began appearing in magazines and documentaries worldwide. King's speech was translated into dozens of languages, inspiring freedom movements from Northern Ireland to South Africa. The march had transformed from a domestic protest into a global symbol of peaceful resistance against injustice. The immediate aftermath revealed how successfully the march had shifted public discourse. Civil rights was no longer a regional issue that could be ignored by national politicians. The march had forced America to confront its contradictions on the world stage, creating pressure for action that would prove impossible to ignore. What began as one August afternoon in Washington was already rippling outward, setting in motion changes that would reshape American law and society in the years ahead. Part 2: The march's influence on civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. The powerful images from August 1963 created a momentum that politicians could no longer ignore. Within months of the march, President Kennedy began pushing harder for comprehensive civil rights legislation. The march had given him the political cover he needed to act boldly. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, inherited both the bill and the moral imperative created by that summer day in Washington. Johnson understood the march had changed everything. The peaceful dignity of 250,000 Americans had made segregation look ugly and indefensible on television screens across the nation. He used this shift in public opinion as a weapon against resistant congressmen. "We have talked long enough about equal rights in this country," Johnson declared, invoking the memory of both Kennedy and King's dream. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 directly addressed the march's core demands. It banned discrimination in public places, outlawed job discrimination, and gave the federal government real power to enforce integration. March organizers like A. Philip Randolph worked closely with congressional allies to shape the bill's language. They had learned from years of organizing how to translate moral demands into legal language that could survive political battles. Southern senators fought back with every tool they had. They launched an 83-day filibuster, the longest in Senate history. Strom Thurmond and his allies hoped to exhaust the bill's supporters, but the march had created too much pressure. Americans had seen what dignity looked like on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and they would not accept delay tactics that preserved discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed a similar pattern. The brutal images from Selma, Alabama, created another wave of national outrage that built on the foundation laid in Washington. Johnson again used the moral authority created by peaceful protesters to push through legislation. The act eliminated literacy tests and other barriers that had kept Black Americans from voting for decades. King and his allies maintained constant pressure on lawmakers throughout both legislative battles. They organized letter-writing campaigns, met with congressmen, and kept civil rights in the headlines. The march had taught them how to use media attention as a political weapon. Every time segregationists used violence against peaceful protesters, they strengthened the case for federal action. The resistance was fierce and often violent. Segregationists bombed churches, attacked protesters, and murdered civil rights workers. They understood that these laws would end their way of life. Some politicians tried to water down the legislation with amendments that would have made enforcement impossible. But the march had created something new in American politics. It had shown that peaceful moral pressure could overcome even the most entrenched opposition. The laws passed because millions of Americans had watched 250,000 of their fellow citizens stand together with dignity and demand justice. That image proved more powerful than any filibuster or terrorist attack. The legislation transformed daily life for millions of Americans, but it also revealed how much work remained ahead. Part 3. Continuation of the struggle, assassinations and ongoing resistance. The celebration of legislative victories proved short-lived. As civil rights laws reached the books, America entered its darkest chapter since the movement began. The forces of resistance had not disappeared. Instead, they adapted and struck back with devastating precision. President Kennedy fell first. On November 22, 1963, gunshots in Dallas silenced the man who had cautiously supported civil rights reform. His death sent shockwaves through a movement that had counted on his growing commitment to racial justice. Many activists wondered if the new president, Lyndon Johnson, would abandon the cause entirely. The violence escalated. In February 1965, Malcolm X collapsed under a hail of bullets at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. His assassination removed a powerful voice that had challenged both white supremacy and what he saw as the limitations of peaceful protest. The loss devastated those who had found hope in his evolving message of human rights and international solidarity. 3 years later, the movement's greatest leader joined the list of fallen heroes. On April 4, 1968, a sniper's bullet killed Martin Luther King Jr. on a Memphis motel balcony. The man who had dreamed of brotherhood lay dead, struck down while supporting striking sanitation workers. His assassination triggered riots in over 100 cities, leaving entire neighborhoods in flames and dozens more dead. These murders revealed the deadly serious opposition to racial change. But the killings represented only the visible tip of a massive campaign of resistance. State governments passed new laws designed to circumvent federal civil rights legislation. Employers found creative ways to maintain segregated workforces. Real estate agents perfected techniques for keeping neighborhoods divided by race. The federal government itself turned hostile. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had long viewed civil rights leaders as dangerous radicals. His agents infiltrated organizations, spread false information, and worked to divide the movement from within. They tapped phones, planted provocateurs, and destroyed reputations through carefully orchestrated smear campaigns. Young activists lost faith in peaceful methods. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee expelled white members and embraced Black Power. The Black Panther Party formed in Oakland, carrying guns and declaring their right to armed self-defense. Riots erupted in Watts, Detroit, and Newark as urban communities exploded in frustration. The government responded with force rather than understanding. Police departments militarized. Surveillance expanded. Politicians won elections by promising law and order instead of racial justice. The backlash transformed the political landscape, making further progress increasingly difficult. Yet the movement persisted despite these devastating losses. New leaders emerged from the ranks. Organizations adapted their strategies. The dream of equality survived even as its greatest champions fell. The question remained whether America would choose the path of justice or allow fear and hatred to define its future. The answer would determine not just the fate of civil rights, but the soul of the nation itself. Part 4. The March's role in inspiring other social justice movements. The March on Washington accomplished something remarkable beyond its immediate goals. It created a blueprint that other groups would study and copy for decades to come. The careful planning, moral clarity, and peaceful power displayed on that August day in 1963 showed how ordinary people could demand extraordinary change. College students were among the first to learn these lessons. As the Vietnam War escalated, young Americans watched how the civil rights movement combined moral arguments with mass action. They organized teach-ins on campuses across the country. Students occupied buildings and held massive rallies, borrowing tactics they had seen work for racial justice. The same songs that echoed through the March on Washington now rang out at anti-war demonstrations. Many students who had participated in civil rights work naturally moved into opposing the war. Women studying these movements noticed how male leaders often dominated the spotlight, even when women did much of the organizing work. This observation sparked conversations that would grow into the women's liberation movement. Female activists had gained valuable experience in civil rights organizations, learning how to build coalitions and challenge unjust systems. They applied these skills to fighting gender discrimination, organizing consciousness-raising groups, and demanding equal rights in workplaces and homes. The March's example reached far beyond American borders. In Northern Ireland, civil rights marchers explicitly modeled their demonstrations on what they had seen from Washington. They sang the same freedom songs and adopted the same commitment to nonviolence. South African activists studying abroad brought these techniques back to their struggle against apartheid. The moral force of King's dream resonated in places where people faced similar injustices. Native American activists watched how the march had captured national attention and forced politicians to act. They organized their own demonstrations, including the occupation of Alcatraz Island and the Trail of Broken Treaties March on Washington. These activists understood that visibility was crucial to their cause, just as it had been for civil rights workers. Environmental protesters discovered that the march's tactics worked for their cause too. Earth Day organizers in 1970 created massive, peaceful demonstrations that brought millions of people together around a shared vision. They borrowed the civil rights movement's ability to make complex issues feel personal and urgent. Even early LGBTQ+ rights activists found inspiration in the march's success. The first gay pride marches deliberately echoed the format of civil rights demonstrations, with speakers, signs, and songs calling for dignity and equality. The courage required to march openly for civil rights provided a model for people demanding acceptance of their own identities. The march's influence spread because it had proven something important about American democracy. When people organized peacefully around clear moral principles, they could force the country to confront its contradictions. This lesson traveled from movement to movement, from country to country, creating a global language of peaceful resistance that continues shaping activism today. Part 5. The enduring symbolism of I Have a Dream in American culture. The March on Washington crystallized into something far greater than a single day's protest. Within months, King's words had traveled from the Lincoln Memorial steps into American classrooms, where teachers began sharing excerpts with students across the country. The speech became required reading, its most famous phrases memorized by children who had not yet been born when King spoke them. Television networks replayed the speech annually, turning August 28th into an unofficial day of national reflection. News anchors would introduce the footage with reverent tones, framing it as a pivotal moment when America's conscience awakened. The images became iconic. The massive crowd stretching toward the Washington Monument, King's hand gestures, the faces in the audience reflecting hope and determination. Politicians discovered the power of referencing the dream. Campaign speeches began incorporating King's vision, with candidates from both parties claiming to carry forward his legacy. Presidential inaugurations featured readings from the speech, and political movements across the spectrum invoked King's words to legitimize their causes. The phrase, "I have a dream," became shorthand for American aspiration itself. Yet this widespread adoption created tensions. Some activists argued that the speech had been sanitized, stripped of its radical demands for economic justice and immediate change. They watched as politicians quoted King's call for unity while ignoring his criticism of moderate whites who preferred order to justice. The dream, they contended, had been transformed into a comfortable myth that allowed America to celebrate progress while avoiding difficult conversations about ongoing inequality. Schools taught the speech as the triumphant climax of the civil rights movement, often presenting it as the moment when racism ended rather than as one battle in a continuing war. Textbooks featured the most uplifting passages, while omitting King's sharper critiques of American society. Students learned about the dream, but not about the economic demands that filled the rest of the march's agenda. The speech's meaning became a battleground. Conservative voices emphasized King's call to judge people by character rather than color, arguing this supported colorblind policies. Progressive activists countered that King's dream required active efforts to dismantle systemic barriers. Each side claimed ownership of his legacy, using his words to support opposing visions of how America should address racial inequality. Media representations further complicated this legacy. Hollywood films portrayed the march as a moment of national unity, often focusing on white allies and downplaying the years of organizing by Black communities. Documentary filmmakers struggled to balance inspiration with historical accuracy, knowing that audiences expected to feel uplifted by King's story. The march had become America's favorite story about itself, a tale of moral awakening and peaceful triumph. This narrative served important purposes, inspiring new generations of activists and providing a model for democratic change. But it also allowed the country to avoid confronting how much of King's dream remained unfulfilled. The enduring power of his words ensured that each generation would have to decide whether to embrace the comfortable memory or grapple with the continuing struggle his dream represented. Chapter 5: Human Stories and Leadership Dynamics. Part 1: The Personalities Behind the Movement. Profiles of Key Leaders. The March on Washington emerged from the minds and hearts of remarkable individuals whose personal stories shaped America's future. Each leader brought unique experiences that would prove essential to the movement's success. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived at this moment through a journey that began in Atlanta's middle-class Black community. His father's activism and his education at Morehouse College planted early seeds of leadership. The young minister found his calling during the Montgomery bus boycott, where he learned that nonviolent resistance could move mountains. By 1963, King carried the weight of being the movement's most recognizable face, yet he understood that this march required more than one voice. A. Philip Randolph represented the bridge between generations of struggle. Born in 1889, he had spent decades fighting for workers' rights through his Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union. Randolph knew Washington's political machinery intimately. He had threatened a similar march 20 years earlier, forcing President Roosevelt to create fair employment practices. Now in his 70s, Randolph brought credibility and strategic wisdom that younger leaders needed. Bayard Rustin possessed the organizational genius that would make the march possible. This openly gay Black man faced criticism from multiple directions, yet his experience planning protests across the globe made him irreplaceable. Rustin had studied Gandhi's methods firsthand and understood how to move masses of people peacefully. His ability to coordinate logistics while managing competing personalities became the march's hidden strength. John Lewis embodied the movement's younger generation. At just 23, he had already faced brutal beatings as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Lewis brought urgency and moral clarity that sometimes made older leaders uncomfortable. His willingness to challenge compromise reflected the impatience many young activists felt with gradual change. Dorothy Height stood as the lone woman among the Big Six leaders, representing millions of Black women whose contributions often went unrecognized. Through her work with the National Council of Negro Women, Height understood that civil rights meant nothing without economic opportunity. Her presence ensured that women's voices, though marginalized in planning, remained part of the conversation. These leaders shared common threads despite their differences. Each had experienced racism's sting personally. Each understood that silence meant accepting injustice. Each possessed the rare courage to risk everything for principles larger than themselves. Their backgrounds created both strength and tension. Generational gaps led to strategic disagreements. Regional differences shaped their approaches. Personal rivalries sometimes threatened unity. Yet they found ways to work together because they shared an unwavering belief that America could become better. The march succeeded because these diverse personalities complemented each other. Randolph provided legitimacy. Rustin brought logistics. King offered inspiration. Lewis demanded urgency, and Height ensured inclusion. Their combined efforts would soon transform a dream into reality, setting the stage for one of history's most powerful demonstrations of collective action. Part 2. Conflicts, Compromises, and Strategic Decisions Among Organizers. The powerful unity displayed on that August day masked months of fierce debate behind closed doors. Civil rights leaders who would later stand shoulder to shoulder had spent countless hours arguing, sometimes shouting, over every detail of the march. These weren't minor disagreements about logistics. They were fundamental battles over the soul and direction of the movement. A. Philip Randolph, now in his 70s, represented the older generation's measured approach. He had spent decades building relationships with labor unions and politicians. Randolph believed change came through careful negotiation and established channels. Across the table sat John Lewis, barely 23, who had already been beaten unconscious on freedom rides. Lewis and the younger activists demanded immediate action. They wanted to challenge the system directly, even if it meant confrontation. The generational divide created explosive tensions during planning meetings. When Lewis drafted his original speech, it contained language so fiery that Archbishop O'Boyle threatened to boycott the entire event. Lewis wanted to ask, which side is the federal government on? and declare that patience had run out. Randolph and King worried such rhetoric would alienate potential allies in Congress and the White House. Bayard Rustin found himself caught between these competing visions. As the march's chief organizer, he needed everyone working together, but his own radical past made him vulnerable. Conservative leaders questioned whether a former communist and openly gay man should have such prominent influence. Rustin had to navigate these personal attacks while mediating between factions that sometimes seemed ready to walk away. The debates over tactics were equally heated. Some leaders wanted to include civil disobedience actions, like blocking traffic or occupying government buildings. Others feared any hint of lawlessness would destroy public support. Dorothy Height pushed for greater representation of women speakers, but faced resistance from male leaders who worried about diluting their message. Money created another source of tension. Different organizations competed for donations and media attention. Regional leaders complained that national figures were overshadowing local efforts. Southern activists argued that their daily risks earned them more say in planning, while Northern supporters countered that their fundraising made the march possible. The compromise that emerged required extraordinary political skill. Lewis agreed to soften his speech, but kept its essential challenge to federal inaction. Women leaders accepted fewer speaking roles in exchange for prominent positions in the program. Radical and moderate organizations shared the platform, each group's presence legitimizing the others. These internal struggles nearly derailed the march multiple times. Yet the leaders ultimately recognized that their differences were less important than their shared goal. They learned to channel their disagreements into strength, creating a coalition broad enough to capture America's attention while focused enough to deliver a clear message. The march's success would prove that principled compromise, rather than rigid ideology, could create the foundation for lasting change. Part 3. The intersection of race, gender, and activism in the march. Behind the powerful display of unity on August 28, 1963, lay deep tensions that threatened to tear the movement apart from within. While the march's visible leadership was predominantly male, women had been the backbone of organizing efforts for months. Dorothy Height, the only woman among the Big Six civil rights leaders, fought tirelessly for female representation in the program. Yet when the final speaking lineup was announced, not a single woman was scheduled to address the crowd from the main platform. This exclusion sparked fierce debates within the movement. Height and other female leaders had built the grassroots networks that made the march possible. Women like Diane Nash had risked their lives in the Freedom Rides. Gloria Richardson led the Cambridge movement in Maryland. Fannie Lou Hamer organized voters in Mississippi despite brutal retaliation. These women had earned their place at the podium through years of dangerous, groundbreaking work. The gender divide reflected deeper power struggles within the civil rights movement. Male leaders, influenced by traditional views of women's roles, often relegated female activists to support positions. They argued that presenting a united front required conventional leadership structures that white America would accept. Women countered that true equality meant including all voices, not just those that made others comfortable. Dorothy Height faced particular challenges as the sole woman in the top leadership circle. She had to prove herself repeatedly to male colleagues who sometimes treated her as a token representative rather than an equal partner. Her diplomatic skills became essential as she worked to bridge the gap between frustrated female activists and defensive male leaders. The exclusion of women from speaking roles also highlighted broader questions about whose voices mattered in the struggle for civil rights. If the movement claimed to fight for equality and justice, critics asked, how could it silence half of its own supporters? Female organizers had raised funds, recruited participants, and handled crucial logistics. Their absence from the platform sent a troubling message about the movement's commitment to its own principles. Race and class divisions further complicated these tensions. Middle-class women, both black and white, often found their perspectives valued more than those of working-class women who faced multiple forms of discrimination. The movement's emphasis on respectability sometimes meant that the experiences of the most marginalized voices were pushed aside in favor of messages that appealed to mainstream audiences. Despite these internal struggles, women continued their essential work. They organized transportation, prepared food for thousands of participants, and managed countless details that made the march possible. Their dedication proved that commitment to the cause transcended recognition or official roles. These gender tensions would not disappear after the march. They would continue to shape the civil rights movement and eventually contribute to the emergence of the women's liberation movement. The contradictions between the movement's public message of equality and its internal practices created lasting questions about whose freedom truly mattered. The march's success depended not only on the famous speeches delivered that day, but also on the largely invisible contributions of women whose stories were only beginning to be told. Part 4. The role of ordinary people and grassroots participants. The buses started rolling before dawn. From Birmingham, Detroit, Chicago, and dozens of smaller towns, ordinary Americans climbed aboard vehicles that would carry them into history. Many had never traveled far from home. Some had scraped together their last dollars for the bus fare. Others had borrowed money from family or church members who believed in their cause. Sarah Johnson, a seamstress from Montgomery, Alabama, knew she risked losing her job. Her white employer had already warned her against going to Washington, but Johnson packed a sandwich and her worn Bible anyway. She had lived through the bus boycotts. She understood that change required ordinary people to do extraordinary things, even when the cost seemed too high. In Mississippi, sharecropper families faced even greater dangers. Local sheriff's departments took down license plate numbers of cars heading north. Some participants received threatening phone calls the night before departure. Banks called in loans. Store owners refused service to families whose members had gone to Washington. Yet the buses kept filling up. The grassroots organizing had taken months. Church basements became meeting halls where volunteers coordinated carpools and collected donations. Women like Fannie Lou Hamer traveled from town to town, speaking to anyone who would listen. They explained why this march mattered, why regular people needed to show up, why their presence would make a difference. Local NAACP chapters worked overtime. They distributed flyers, organized fundraisers, and helped people arrange time off work. Many employers threatened to fire anyone who attended the march. Some workers lied about their destinations, claiming family emergencies or medical appointments. Others simply accepted that their jobs might not exist when they returned. The night before the march, Washington's hotels and churches filled with these ordinary heroes. They came from different backgrounds, but shared similar fears and hopes. A teacher from Philadelphia worried about her principal's reaction. A factory worker from Cleveland wondered if his union would protect him. A grandmother from rural Georgia prayed that her sacrifice would help her grandchildren live better lives. These grassroots participants understood something profound. They knew that famous leaders could give speeches, but real change required thousands of regular people willing to risk everything. Their collective presence would transform individual dreams into a national movement. When morning came, they walked toward the Lincoln Memorial, carrying more than signs and banners. They carried the hopes of entire communities who could not make the journey. They represented millions of Americans who faced daily discrimination but had found the courage to demand better. Their stories would largely go untold in newspaper accounts focused on famous speeches. But without their courage, their sacrifices, and their unwavering commitment, the March on Washington would have been just another gathering of leaders talking to empty spaces, instead of a defining moment that changed America forever. Part 5. Reflections on Courage, Hope, and the Power of Collective Action. Standing at the Lincoln Memorial as the crowds dispersed, many participants carried something different than what they had brought that morning. They had witnessed the power of people coming together for a shared cause, and that experience would shape their understanding of what was possible in America. The march demonstrated that ordinary citizens, when united by common purpose, could command the attention of an entire nation and force difficult conversations about justice and equality. The courage displayed that day took many forms. Some marchers had risked their jobs simply by attending. Others faced threats from neighbors or employers who opposed their participation. Yet they came anyway, understanding that personal risk was the price of progress. Their bravery wasn't the dramatic kind celebrated in movies, but the quiet determination of people who believed change was worth the sacrifice. Hope emerged as the day's most powerful force. King's dream resonated because it offered a vision of America that many had never dared imagine possible. His words painted a picture of a future where children would be judged by character rather than skin color, where former enemies might sit together in brotherhood. This wasn't naive optimism, but hope grounded in the belief that people could choose to be better than their worst impulses. The march proved that solidarity could bridge significant differences. Labor unions stood with civil rights groups. Religious leaders from various faiths shared the same platform. Young activists worked alongside their elders despite disagreements about tactics. These alliances showed that movements for justice gain strength when they welcome diverse voices and perspectives. The event's legacy continues to guide contemporary activists worldwide. When protesters gather in Hong Kong, when women march for equality, when environmental advocates demand action, they often reference the March on Washington as proof that peaceful demonstration can create lasting change. The blueprint established that day shows how to organize massive events, build coalitions, and maintain focus on clear goals. Modern movements have learned crucial lessons from 1963. They understand the importance of preparing carefully, choosing messages that resonate broadly, and presenting unity despite internal disagreements. They recognize that sustainable change requires both dramatic moments like the march and long-term organizing in local communities. The march taught that transformation happens when individual courage meets collective action. One person speaking truth to power can inspire others, but real change requires thousands of people willing to act on shared convictions. The marchers who traveled to Washington proved that democracy works best when citizens actively participate in shaping their society's future. Today's activists inherit both the victories and ongoing challenges from that August day. The March on Washington reminds us that progress requires constant vigilance and that each generation must decide whether to accept injustice or work to create the world they want to see.